Mitigation is actions taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risks to people and property from natural hazards and their effects. Perfectly good definition. It kind of captures exactly what we're talking about in terms of these various actions that we can potentially undertake in a community. I really like Lindell, Prater, and Prairie's definition, though, in that when they talk about mitigation or when we talk about mitigation policies and actions, we're talking about pre-impact actions that provide passive protection at the time of disaster impact. In other words, these are the kinds of actions that we do not have to rapidly put them into place right before an event. They're already there. We don't have to think about it. They are, in effect, passive protection that we don't have to worry about in that rapid buildup to an event, or in the case of an earthquake, no buildup, it just happens. We've already got those things in place. Let me just kind of give you an overview of different kinds of mitigation actions that we could be talking about here, and then I'll kind of target in again on what I will be principally addressing. First kind of cluster or group would be hazard source control mitigation actions, and essentially we're talking about actually guarding against or controlling the source of the potential hazard. So if we think about fires, especially wildfires, we're talking about not only controlling and fire suppression, but also fuel controls. That is, an awful lot of the mitigation actions are keeping the fuel that the fire needs to expand and everything at low levels, or if indeed not existent, and so we can protect our housing and the like. If we're talking about chemical industries, we're talking about using non-toxic chemicals, preventing leaks, reducing quantities that may be going through highly vulnerable areas and the like. So the focus there is on controlling the source to begin with. Community protection works. These are the kinds of things that we usually think about when we talk about structural mitigation. We're talking about major community works like setting up dams, levees, river channelization, canals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was the backbone of our hazard mitigation program throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, and about in the 70s we began to challenge some of those things, and certainly now we're recognizing that many of those were really just temporary fixes and didn't do the job completely, and indeed resulted in us increasing our vulnerability. Land use practices. Here we'll be talking about acquisition of land, development rights, acquisition of those development rights, zoning, subdivision regulations, various tax incentives, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to go through a whole litany of them as we go deeper into this course. Implementation through types of risk communication, that is, helping people understand what's at risk, how they can reduce those levels of risk through adopting these different land use practices. Incentive-based approaches as well as sanction-based approaches. Building and construction practices are a big issue. So we're talking building codes, we're talking strengthening components of our buildings. For example, with wind issues, connecting the roof to the walls, a minor little thing like that is quite important in keeping the roof on when high winds strike an area. Structural protection from flood, wind, and seismic, so we're talking about different kinds of shutter systems, for example, for windows, changing the nature of the windows, using some kind of laminated window or impact-resistant window and the like. Retrofitting programs, extraordinarily important, especially out in earthquake areas. Many of the old buildings just simply are not designed to stand up to the different kind of forces that they'll be subjected to, and special utility codes and the like. Big, important issues, and amazing how many places do not have building codes, even here in the United States, as I'll show in a few minutes. Natural resource preservation and restoration is another critical area, an area that we need to be focusing much more on. But we're talking about preserving and restoring our natural resources and the ecosystem services they provide. So we're talking about preserving and restoring wetlands, revegetation and reforestation to prevent landslides, to prevent erosion, dune protection, habitat protection areas, and the like. These are often overlooked. Indeed, it's an extraordinarily depressing situation in many states in terms of the degree to which these are completely off the realm of possibilities. But yet, as Katrina, I think, has pointed out to many of us, issues of wetland preservation are absolutely critical. Risk communication, education, and outreach programs, targeting the public, getting accurate information about their risk and vulnerability assessment so they better understand the nature of what they are likely to encounter. Simple things like signage to educate the public into different hazard exposures, showing where flood zones are, showing that you're entering a flood zone, showing where fault lines are, and things like that. A lot of stuff that developers don't like, but also are highly effective in terms of educating the public. Hazard disclosure for property. Many of y'all may have bought a home and you usually have a hazard disclosure in terms of flood. Oftentimes those are not there in terms of all property transfers. Increasing that is an important dimension that we can look at. Comprehensive education programs, especially education programs within school. There's no way more effective to get parents to do something than to get the kids talking about those issues and asking why. Why are we doing this? Why aren't we doing that? Can drive an awful lot of what happens at the household level. And then there are these even more subtle mitigation actions that we can engage in. Developing of what I'd like to think about is social infrastructural development. Looking at community and neighborhood-based organizations, especially those that target vulnerable populations. These kinds of grassroots organizations can be critically important, especially in terms of preparation activities and long-term recovery activities. Promoting nonprofits and other community-based organizations that address chronic vulnerabilities. So issues like food banks, women's shelters, and the like can become valuable resources in the post and pre and post disaster situation. In Hurricane Andrew, I was living in Florida at the time, and the migrant labor organizations became extraordinarily effective at helping the migrant labor community get back on its feet, and actually get back on its feet quite quickly in terms of the time span. Partnerships and reciprocal agreements, both inside and between communities, can be very important. We'll see that this actually can be a driver for enhanced mitigation. Housing programs, maintenance programs, and equitable neighborhood infrastructure improvement and maintenance programs are important. Oftentimes, the most vulnerable areas are often populated by highly vulnerable, low-income populations. Those areas that need to have the infrastructure improvement and investment are often the last. And what can happen is then increased flood risk, increased flooding damage, and the like. We saw that with Hurricane Ike in Galveston, for example. The world, in some sense, changed after 2000 with the Hazard Mitigation Act of 2000. At that point, the federal government began to start stressing the need for local hazard mitigation plans. Really, these should be more properly talked about as local hazard mitigation action plans, because basically what they are designed to do is to evaluate the vulnerability of a community, county, or region, look at what kinds of actions may reduce potential vulnerabilities in the future, and then prioritize those actions. So after an event, they begin to channel where the resources, the mitigation resource dollars, can and should be spent afterwards. There's been a good bit of work done on comprehensive plans, and actually some work recently done on hazard mitigation plans. So we're beginning to see that a little bit of work on those areas. We did a full evaluation of the coastal hazard mitigation plans for Texas. There were regional plans. As you can see, these large colored areas were regional plans. There were a couple county plans and even some city plans in the area. Indeed, there were a total of 12 mitigation plans covering the entire coast of Texas. 3 municipality, 4 county, and 5 regional plans. Included in there were 112 municipalities, that is, that were included in some of the regional and county plans as well, too. We decided we would evaluate those plans just to kind of get a sense of what was going on in terms of, in part, their effectiveness, and in part, their likely effectiveness in terms of what kinds of policies and actions were they targeting to begin with. We basically followed a series of research initiatives that were actually, many of them happening in Chapel Hill, Phil Burke, David Gottschalk, Sam Brody when he was there. Sam Brody is now at Texas A&M, which we developed these protocols to evaluate these hazard mitigation plans. We looked at 5 components of the plans: their vision statement, planning process, their fact bases, et cetera, as you can see on the slide there. And then within each of those, we looked at specific elements and actually evaluated then the degree to which these elements were addressed within each of the plans. To kind of give you a sense of how things turned out, I've got this bar graph. I hope it's not too much to kind of address, but if you'll basically look across the bottom here, we've got each of the 7 different areas that we targeted: vision, process, the fact basis, goals, etc., and then our total score as well too. The blue bar represents the total across all of the 12 plans we evaluated, and then we've got a bar for each of the different kind: county plans, city plans, and total. Overall, this axis also reflects then the kind of score for the plan out of 100 possible points. This was much more rigorous than the FEMA crosswalk because all these plans were approved by FEMA. So in some sense, it's not a fair scoring in that we were very detailed in it. In the other sense, we wanted to get the public to understand where their where their plan stood relative to the potential that could be covered by the nature of that plan. Overall, there's the total. You see it was about 35%. The total scores were relatively low, so there's an awful lot of room for improvement. In general, the city plans were significantly lower than the other 2 plans. If you'll notice, the green bar generally is lower than the gold and gray bars, which are for the county and regional plans. On average, they were much lower as well, too. What was particularly, I guess I must say, disappointing was the fact basis for the plans. The fact basis, remember, are those elements in which we actually evaluate the nature of the hazard exposure, the potential risk of a community. We basically saw these plans scoring at about 33%, and in particular, the city plans were around in the 20% level. So that is, of all the different kind of approaches to assessing the vulnerabilities, they were quite low. The policies as well were quite low as well. About 28% of all policies that could potentially be addressed were actually examined in these plans. That reflects a relatively low portfolio, if you will, of a variety of different mitigation policies in which they were looking at. Indeed, across the total of 12 plans, there were 836 mitigation actions. That means, again, with each plan, they were supposed to identify the actions at which they would use mitigation dollars should there be a post-event funding of mitigation actions. 34% dealt with structural kinds of things, so levees, seawalls, and those kinds of issues. Again, those traditional approaches. 24% were emergency management things, so not even really addressing broad-based hazard mitigation, but rather dealing with emergency management activities and actions. Now, quite frankly, knowing that the low levels of funding, there was an important opportunity to get these things in there, but again, it kind of shows a shift away from actual mitigation, looking at emergency management. We were happy to see about 25% dealt with some kind of regulatory or planning activity to help promote mitigation planning. About 14% dealt with education and awareness programs. Most disheartening, only 1.4% of all the 800 looked at natural resource protection and restoration. So overall, there's a good deal of room for improvement, particularly in terms of the fact basis. Oftentimes, these were kind of cookie cutter approaches that were quite standard and often didn't really address all of the different hazards that an area would be potentially exposed to. Cities have the greatest need for improvement, and there's a high degree of disconnect, which was most disconcerting, disconnect between the hazard mitigation plans and other planning activities. Indeed, planners were oftentimes not involved in the process at all. It was dealt with by emergency management, and there wasn't an interface with the planning department. So a real loss of opportunity to kind of talk about consistency across plans at the community level.